I've done similar videos to this one for the Amiga, featuring the worst rated games from the pages of Amiga Power and Amiga format, and well, it would be rude not to do a ZX Spectrum centric one. The existence of 3 Specky mags that towered over everyone else in the market makes this a simple enough task that fits neatly into a listicle. There are 20 titles that got a score of 10% or less from either Your Sinclair, Crash or Sinclair User, so it's a nice round number. Now, most of the titles actually aren't the sort that are famously among the worst Spectrum games nowadays. A lot of those ones that have bubbled up to the surface over the years didn't really get reviewed by anyone. That or once again they didn't quite score bad enough. Hairraiser, one of the system's biggest cons, got a 3 out of 10 from Sinclair User. BMX Ninja, Alternative's absolute budget shocker, didn't get reviewed in any of the mags, and the same applies to Sqij, something that could objectively be the worst game ever made. That only ever got mentioned as part of a lousy compilation alongside 7 other games. That said, there is the odd infamous title kicking around here and there, along with others that, even if they aren't usually placed amongst the system's worst games these days, they absolutely should be. A couple of important notes before beginning. A lot of the hard yards here were won by a thoroughly good chap named Pete Proch, who stuck in the appropriate queries on ZXDB and then made a post detailing the games that the Spectrum mags thought were the worst on the Spectrum computing forums, thus making the compiling of such a thing very easy indeed. Links to Pete's socials and said posts will be present here, and also if you fancy looking at another person who enjoys exploring the worst, or indeed the best rated games from various old mags, I'll throw a link over to Seb's Place, who also covers this ground. You may also spot quickly that the list is rather front-loaded with games reviewed by Sinclair User. This is because SU generally scored games out of 10, as opposed to using a percentage score, so they never actually went lower than 10%. Anyway, with all that, well, let's get going. We start with a game that's completely unknown. Bananablip and Spacemanblip is missing in action, although happily it's the only lost game in this vid. Its solitary 10% review from Sinclair User back in November 1987 represents all we know. The game was released by Lilu Software, which appears to be a single-person label operating out of a flat in Blackpool, and this is their only title. There's 2 games in this budget release. In Bananablip you get shown pictures and have to choose what they represent, and in Spacemanblip you have to predict a spaceman's next move from a list of them that appears and disappears very quickly. They certainly don't sound good, but there's not really any way to judge. It doesn't look like anybody bought this tape at all, let alone held onto it and dumped it onto the internet, and the review features no screenshots. In short, this one's a mystery. We can happily access the next game, Battlecars from 1984. This is a computer version of Games Workshop's turn-based car combat board game, a decently successful dystopian affair devised by Gary Chalk and Ian Livingstone, and largely converted here by the legend that is Julian Gollop. Now, you wouldn't exactly expect to see a game with this sort of pedigree here, and most of the original 1985 reviews for the title are at least average. However, it lands here thanks to a short 1988 budget re-review from Your Sinclair, which scorched the title and gave it 1 out of 10. Your Sinclair kind of flittered between using percentages and scores out of 10, which can be rather annoying. The game is quite odd. You pick 2 cars to race against each other on one of 2 tracks, one called the Aerodrome, which is more suitable for racing, and another called Slug City that's more geared towards combat, although annoyingly I've only been able to access the Aerodrome. It's 1 or 2 player, and there's not too much beyond said racing. There is some strategy in that you can design a car of your own as opposed to using the presets, although there isn't really a whole lot of customisation. The graphics aren't great, and it can be a bit hard to understand, but still it's not amongst the worst Specky games I've played. Nowhere near a 1 out of 10 for me. The budget re-review is short and mainly complains about accidentally hitting break and discovering basic code. Our critic seems to believe that the whole thing's written in BASIC. Now, this may be the case, as Battlecars is an early Gollop title that could be from before he started using machine code, But it is amusing to see the review give advice that the author should learn machine code as it sees you in the long run, when said author is Julian frickin' Gollop, you know, the guy who made Chaos and Rebel Star and Laser Squad and XCOM and so on. As I mentioned previously, the game by the powerhouse that you would expect to be here, the dreaded Sqij, is not. But that doesn't mean there's no powerhouse at all, mind you, seeing as the majority of this rather short-lived software house's releases were, quite frankly, crap. Freedom Fighter here, from 1988, is a very standard space shooter, one that is somewhat outmoded for the time, feeling like a very typical budget title. And it's here thanks to getting a 1 out of 10 from Sinclair User in July of 1988, with SU's Nat Price saying that even the most warped of shoot-'em-up addicts will avoid this one. Anyway, you beat the waves of enemies before coming up against a boss ship, and you do have to collect items on the way down that the manual calls concussion bombs, but, well, they look more like sperms. The collision detection is quite lousy and the game is generally frustrating, but it is obviously a whole other level ahead of Sqij, even if it is pretty crap. The maker of this game, John Paul Eldridge, was more famous for doing the music on several Codemasters games, mainly ones by the Oliver Twins, including the original Dizzy. One of the hallmarks of the games that are compiled here is that one of the main reasons for their terribleness is how utterly incomprehensible they are, and that's certainly the case with HeadStart. This 1987 Bug Bite release was only reviewed by Sinclair User, and they gave it 1 out of 10. Tony Dillon said that if this got into the top 100 games, he'd eat his granny. This wasn't the first time the game had been around, mind you. It was originally released by Quicksilver in 1985 under the name of Schizophrenia, and Your Sinclair gave that 4 out of 10. The odd premise of the game is that you have to hit various switches in order to progress through the levels, while your alter ego runs about trying to thwart your progress, mainly through screwing around with the switches himself. The thing that ruins this completely is the collision detection, which is totally broken. The mere act of trying to climb stairs is filled with dread, seeing as even the slightest pixel out of place will result in you falling all the way back down to the bottom. And it's even worse when you're actually trying to hit a switch. You make the movements to try and hit them, but it just feels random as to whether they actually work or not. The guy who made this game, Paul Hargreaves, went on to make a few perfectly okay budget actioners under his belt for the likes of Mastertronic, but alas, this is one that misses the mark, and was one of the games used to show just how far Bug Bite, once a big name indeed in the world of the Sqij, had fallen. Not the worst example, mind you. That's coming. The ZX Spectrum, it must be said, is not generally known for being a go-to platform when it comes to the age-old fighting game. Almost all of the big 8-bit micro-fighters are best played on other platforms aside from it, whether it's Barbarian, Way of the Exploding Fist, or, geez, definitely International Karate. And here is another really quite horrid example. Kickboxing, a 1987 game from Telecom Soft on the Firebird label. This is an isometric fighting game, which isn't a sight you usually see, but the controls are the usual hold a direction and press button sort of thing you would find in most fighters of the time. However, the dodgy implementation and utterly bonkers collision detection, not to mention the non-existent animations, makes it impossible to accurately hit anything. You're best off just flailing around at random, as if you do that, you may well hit your solitary opponent, Mick the Meat Kicker, every once in a while. Again, it's Sinclair User who gave this a 1 out of 10, with Tamara Howard saying that it's games like this that give the budget software industry a bad name, and I can't help but agree completely. Unfortunately, I have found a fighter here that is truly right down there with both Highlander and BMX Ninja, an absolute misery of an effort that, even at the price of $1.99, is nothing more than an insult to anyone who was unfortunate enough to buy it. We follow that pile up with one of this video's more infamous games. It's early 1987, and Grand Slam have a game that was originally called Peter Shilton's Football. However, after the English goalkeeper got outjumped by a much smaller Argentinian legend at the 1986 World Cup, outstretched hand or not, the game was eventually released under the much more blatant cash grab title Peter Shilton's Handball Maradona. The 1 out of 10 score from Sinclair User actually comes from its re-release, which happened later in the year, and well, the funny thing is that this game does have kind of a unique concept for the time, as there's not many football games where you exclusively play as the goalkeeper. It is a very poorly made bit of code, but I almost get a kick out of it because of that. Almost. The problem is that all the situations are totally canned with very little in the way of variation, so the game is more like a test of memorisation as opposed to a test of reflexes. Oh, and it's very unstable. There's very few times where I've played the game and it hasn't ended with a crash back to basic. There's not exactly a whole lot of impetus to make your way through the 16 skill levels, seeing as there's no real league table to speak of or much of anything except a succession of random teams, but honestly it's not too bad for a budget title. The main trouble with this one, however, is that, again, in the spirit of cashing in on Peter Shilton's Mexican misfortunes, this was originally released as a full price title. £2 is just about acceptable for this game, £3 is frankly pushing it, but £7? Sod off. No wonder it got re-released pretty sharpish as a budget game months later. We've got another thoroughly indecipherable title here, Pneumatic Hammers, a Firebird budget release from 1987. The premise is somewhat novel in that you have to try and regain control of a machine in a research base before it buries the base you're in, but the controls and how you actually do things is just completely baffling, and what little instructions there are basically offer no help. Unfortunately, because of that, there's not a whole lot to say here, as, try as I might, I simply can't make head nor tail of this one at all, and the reviewers of the time had similar trouble. The 1 out of 10 comes from Sinclair User, who mainly had a go at the abundance of spelling errors and the lack of any joystick option, but the other mags also appear to have been baffled by it, and those who figured the game out appeared to find that there wasn't actually much to do at all. Who knows, maybe this is better on C64 or Amstrad. Up next is a game that some people may know, Realm of Impossibility. It's a little bit of an odd duck to see this here, perhaps. This is a conversion of an American game by Mike Edwards, one that was originally released in 1983 for the Atari 8-bits as Zombies, before then getting a re-release in 1984 as Realm of Impossibility by Electronic Arts, who had also released versions for the Apple II and the C64. On those platforms, Realm of Impossibility appears to be a pretty well-liked game, one where you explore dungeons in search of items, laying down crosses or using spells in order to thwart the various monsters that are chasing you. And unfortunately, those who enjoyed the game in its earlier incarnations may well be dismayed by what Ariolasoft did to it when it was converted to the Spectrum in 1986. Because unfortunately, this is a misery. The movement is so much slower, and the graphics are so flickery, and such flickering graphics are definitely a sign that BASIC is heavily involved here. Even if the game is a pretty early one in general and may not necessarily have held up too well nowadays, this was shocking by 1986 standards, and while you can easily see the appeal of the earlier versions of the game, this Spectrum effort is an absolute joke. Crash gave it the 10% mark, and they were shocked at the completely needless multi-load, the lack of personality in the graphics and the awful colour clash issues, the flickering, the almost total lack of sound. It's a mess, I'm afraid. And Ariolasoft were trying to sell this pig turd for £9, thus making it more offensive than the majority of budget games featured in this video. Horrid. Are you bad enough to smear yourself in rat droppings, bust into a building, rescue hostages and deal with dangerous terrorists? Well, that's the question that S.A.S. Operation Thunderflash asks of you. This 1986 budget release comes from an obscure publisher named Super Sparkles, who seemingly only released 2 games, this being one of them, and it was also re-released by the more successful yet still rather minor Top 10 Software. It's this release that got a 1 out of 10 from Sinclair User in 1988. This is a shooter of sorts, but it's an isometric filmation style one, although those graphics are a bit ropey here. Still, the tank-like controls you expect of games like this are present and correct. This game is hard as hell. If you approach it like a regular arcade shooter, you will die immediately. The terrorists track your every move and have lightning-fast reactions, so they will gun you down the second you get in their line of sight. So I suppose the key here is to approach the game more like a puzzler, to try and find the one spot you can get in at the right time in order to get the drop on the enemy. And this sort of thing may actually appeal to some people. I can't say it appeals to me much though. Definitely not one of the worst games here, but still not one I would want to play again. In a similar vein to the earlier realm of Impossibility, Saracen is another title that's of American origin. Originally made by Ilan Ginsberg and published by Datasoft for the Apple II, you can also find a Ginsberg-made version for the Commodore 64. However, the game would then get a rather inferior run out on the ZX Spectrum in 1987. This is actually the lowest rated Sqij release from one of the biggest companies of them all, that being US Gold, on their budget label, Americana. Again, people might automatically assume something like World Cup Carnival would have taken that honour. The game itself is a variation on Boulder Dash that's largely based around picking up and firing arrows, and the original C64 title gives you 100 quite expansive levels to figure out. This one only gives you 40, although you can choose whichever level you want. The graphics and movements were the things that primarily came in for a kick in here. In their 1 out of 10 review, Sinclair User said that it looked like pre-ZX81 programming and that it was the great space race of the budget world. Now, I grant that it's certainly not a looker, although again it is a game that might have appeal to some. A pretty significant and original twist on the Boulder Dash formula. It's not terrible at all, but definitely one that I would rather play on the C64 as opposed to the Spectrum. It is a little surprising, considering just how much sports-related dross you're likely to find on an 8-bit microsystem, that there is only one football game here. And it's Soccer Boss. Because hey, if we are going to do this, it may as well be a football management game. Originally, this came out in 1984 and was simply called The Boss. It wasn't reviewed by anyone in its original form, but alternative software picked the game up over 3 years later, releasing it as Soccer Boss. And hoo boy, it's one of Alternative's worst. Again, it's right down there with BMX Ninja. This wasn't even any good in its original form, to be honest. A wholly basic footy manny title that runs very, very slowly. Seriously, it takes so long just for a table to be shown after each game's finished that you wonder if the whole thing's just given up the ghost, and the matches are just a whole load of nothingness. Basically, this was a Temu version of Kevin Tom's Football Manager from 1982, a game that may also be basic, and maybe 2 years older, but it runs frickin' rins around this crap, which can't even do that game's simple yet oh so important match highlights. Eventually though, in the belief that anything related to a leather ball can be sold to gullible idiots, Alternative put this on the shelves in frickin' late 1987. Sinclair User weren't having it. They said that if anyone bought this and put it in the charts, they'd be very upset. Happily, it doesn't appear as though the game made it that far. I should note that there were adverts for the original full-price Peaksoft mail-order version of this title, printed in mags as late as December 1986. So perhaps I shouldn't be quite so cross at Alternative for sticking this out as a budget title, god-awful though it may be. Unfortunately, the powerhouse are back again. It's another shooter, and it's a lot worse than Freedom Fighter. 1988's Space Jack is a 3-part title, although admittedly I've only been able to access 2 of them. The first is, honestly, one of the worst attempts at a space shooter I've seen on the platform, and there's a lot of miserable ones. This basically goes wrong the moment you try to move your ship up or down. Your vessel is always in the centre, and waves of enemies appear out of nowhere, making them impossible to react to, especially with everything being so big. There is a way through, mind you. The best thing to do is not move at all and just go straight forward. That way you'll actually miss most of the aliens completely, and you'll have an easier time blasting anything that comes in your way. Great, huh? The second part of this game is a miserable platformer on the planet's surface where you have to collect eggs. I wasn't able to get past this part, mainly because your hero moves so frickin' slowly. My goodness. It's what you think trying to run Exelon on a ZX80 would look like, in all honesty. I'm afraid I didn't quite have the fortitude to reach that third part, but it doesn't appear that the reviewers of the time did either, as I can't find any details on just what that third part entailed. Your Sinclair's 1 out of 10 review wonders just why the powerhouse has all the corniest plots and naffest games, with Nat Price considering it one of the worst games he's ever played, and as Your Sinclair's resident budget reviewer, he's played his fair share of crap. Space Jack isn't well known today, but honestly, yeah, this is definitely one of the worst Sqij games. Again, the only thing that stops this from being Powerhouse's worst title is the existence of Sqij. Next up, we have Survival. I was a little curious at first when I saw lists on Pete Podger's list. When you think of survival on the ZX Spectrum, chances are you probably think of the 1984 educational game from Sinclair and Macmillan, one that most people probably have in their Sqij collection, seeing as how it was a packing title. However, this is actually a wholly different game named Survival. What we've got here is the video's only text adventure, released in 1985 by Central Solutions. Like a lot of text adventures, this is made with the help of Gilsoft's The Quill and Illustrator. And as much as I dearly love Tim Gilbert's for inspiring so many people to write their own text adventures, and just being a jolly good bloke in general, a game like Survival is a rather unfortunate result of that software's success. You play as an MI5 agent named Gary Gullible who's parachuted into some secret island base or whatever, and my experience went as follows. It wasn't long before I got into a fight with a guard which, played out like this. I had no input in this whole sequence, and it's about as exciting as it looks. I did end up winning this fight, made my way through a few areas, until coming across some more guards. These guards apparently could smell the cheese pasty that I was carrying, meaning that they captured me and the game was over. Of course, I had no idea that I was carrying a cheese pasty to begin with. This is the sort of thing that I would expect from John Robertson's The Dark Room, and my reaction is perhaps predictable. A very poor text adventure indeed, I'm afraid, and I appear to have had much the same experience as Your Sinclair did when they gave the game 1 out of 10, with the added bonus that apparently, even though the game is supposed to have save load functionality, it doesn't actually work, because the game doesn't recognise load as a command. That's not very clever, is it? We have one more 10% game here, and it's TimeTrax. This is one of the stranger games to find here, mainly because it's probably got the best reviews out of any title in this whole vid. On its original 1986 release, this binary design adventure got generally okay scores, including a 7 out of 10 from Your Sinclair. However, the budget re-release of this game in 1988 got a 1 out of 10 from Sinclair User, with Tony Dillon calling it unoriginal, unexciting, unmotivating, unplayable, and almost unbelievable junk. There is definitely a bit more polish here than you'll find in the other games on this list, a decent bit of music, and rather colourful graphics. The whole thing looks a fair bit like Little Computer People, and it sort of plays like Impossible Mission in that a lot of time's going to be spent using the menus and looking through various pieces of furniture in order to find items you need, such as weapons or tiles that you need to present to the 8 mines. In short, there is quite a lot going on here, and although admittedly I can't really get to grips with this title, I don't think it wants a place here in the slightest. I mean, clearly there is so much more depth, ambition and skill that went into this compared to something like frickin' Soccer Boss or Kickboxing or Peter Shilton's Handball Maradona. So this is kind of like seeing Secret of the Silver Blades in the worst rated Amiga Power Games video. Oh, Jesus. Well, at least this one can't be questioned. Bloody Count Duckula 2. Alternative's absolute nadir, and a game that we have crossed swords with a couple of times before. So, the good news. This is at least better than the Amstrad CPC version, seeing as it features the rather short opening space shooter stage, and when you get to the platforming bit you can actually jump properly, even when you're at the top of the screen. The bad news, of course, is that the game is still a completely irredeemable piece of shit. One of the ugliest, slowest, and flat-out most contemptible games of the whole 8-bit micro era. And it came out in late 1992. What was even the point of it at this stage? It all looks like it was knocked up in about 15 minutes and, well, let's face it, it probably was. Your Sinclair reviewed this twice. First time around, in December 1992, John Pillar gave it 9% and said they couldn't believe the game wasn't programmed in 1982, let alone 1992. It then got reviewed again in March of 1993, yeah, really late, as part of the alternative Kids Pack 2, and it actually got a better score of 10%. In her review, Linda Barker, YS's Noble editor, said that she originally wondered if John Pillar was too harsh on the game, and she made him argue it out. And John, of course, convinced her that such a low score was totally warranted. 9% is the lowest score, for a serious game anyway, in Your Sinclair's history, and that is exactly what Count Duckula 2 deserves. And here, with the same score as Count Duckula 2, only this time from Crash magazine, is another quite infamous title, Voyage into the Unknown. This 1984 game may well have ended up in a few people's hands. It was a Mastertronic budget release, so you'd likely find it in your corner shop. It's got a cool title, a cool little bit of box art, it's only £2. So you get it, load it up, and you're greeted with something that, in all honesty, is barely even a game. Mainly, it's a load of basic text, with the tiniest graphic screen ever that pretty much just plays out. The game shouts various directions or events at you from time to time, but it's hard to make head nor tail of any of it. The reviewers at Crash went absolutely mad, wondering what on earth a buke is, bemoaning meaningless jargon phrases like time warp chuck out, musing on whether this is the sort of game you deserved if you were only willing to pay $1.99 for one, and so forth. Not good, to say the least. Voyage into the Unknown shows, I suppose, that the even more infamous Great Space Race is not entirely alone when it comes to the world of presenting a space-based game that promises a lot, but is largely nothing but text, that you have almost zero control over. Although at least Voyage into the Unknown only cost £2, as opposed to bloody 15. Chances are pretty good that most Sqij fans already know this game here, the original Advanced Lawnmower Simulator from 1988, penned by Your Sinclair's Duncan MacDonald and given a Mega Game rating as a bit of a joke. The whole thing was a send-up of Codemasters in particular and their endless Advanced X Simulator games, and it's quite funny on the whole. Funny enough for it to even make appearances outside of the original. Why, there's an Amiga version, and there's even a version for the Spectrum Next. Oh, and there is also this sequel, Advanced Lawnmower Simulator 2 from 1990. This sequel wasn't actually by YS themselves, but was submitted to the magazine as a reader's game courtesy of Joseph Aaron, responsible for other gems such as Car Seating Arrangement Designer, and a couple of early entries into the annual crap game contests that comp.sys.sinclair have won for the past 25 years or so. This certainly isn't trying to make a good game out of YS's piss take. It's presented as a 128K version with additions such as bombs on the lawn that you're never going to reach, or a redefined keys option that's so new there wasn't enough time to actually get it working. You barely get through the grass, a bomb goes off and your mower's fuel starts leaking, and soon enough the game just ends. Rich Pelly's review carries on with the joke nicely, making out that there's a whole trilogy of Lawnmower games here, even if, as far as I can tell, there is only this one, calling it utter crap and eventually giving it 8%. Now, while technically this is the lowest score in Your Sinclair's history, it's clearly a big old piss take, and so really, the honour of YS's worst reviewed game should go to Count Duckula 2. Indeed, even if I were to take Advanced Lawnmower Simulator 2 entirely at face value, I would still want to play it over Count Duckula 2. There's only one game in this video that got 10% or less ratings from 2 of the big 3 magazines, and here it is. Piggy. This 1988 budget release from Bug-Byte Software got absolutely eviscerated, earning a 1 out of 10 from Sinclair User and a 7% score from Crash. Hell, Your Sinclair only gave it 2 out of 10, meaning that this is quite possibly the overall worst rated game to be reviewed by all 3 of the big mags. Spectrum Computing gives it an average score of 12.33% across the 3 reviews. Tony Dillon of SU wondered how people could even hope to get away with such unforgivable trash, and Crash were appalled that a company as old as Bug-Byte could release a game that looks like an unreleased title from 1983. That's the general theme here, bemoaning on just how far the mighty had fallen. Bug-Byte were once sun gods, the folks who released Manic Miner and so on. And now here we are with Piggy. Now, it should be said that by this stage, Bug-Byte wasn't much more than a label run by Argus Press Software. The original company folded in 1985, and at this time, Argus Press themselves were about to undergo their own change into Grand Slam. So honestly, the complaints about the state of Bug-Byte in these reviews do come a little late in the day. You've probably figured this game out while I've been rattling on. It's a simple arcade adventure where you're a little pig and you've got to rebuild your house that's been blown down by the big bad wolf. You dodge the critters, find the pieces, and do that until everything's back to normal. Pretty simple stuff. The music and sound is very naff indeed, and the collision detection is dodgy. Although I must say that even if Piggy is generally pretty crap and not exactly a game I would be thrilled about playing again, it's nowhere near as bad as some of the other games that I've featured in this video. I'd definitely rather play it over blooming Space Jack. We are getting down to the nitty gritty. There's 2 games to go, both reviewed by Crash, and this next one, Video Classics, scored all of 5%. A Silverbird budget title from 1989, what we have here is essentially a cassette tape version of an old Pong console that's also known as Blip. You've got everything you would expect from such a thing: the regular old tennis, football where you can move one of the bats forward, hockey, squash, as well as something called asteroids. There's some asteroids moving around the field of play, and naturally they will have an effect on the ball. Crash hated this, saying that it's the world's worst game collection, although conversely Your Sinclair gave it 5 out of 10, only calling it pretty dull, and complimenting the backgrounds. Obviously this is mainly meant for 2 players. You can play this against the computer, but they will pretty much never let the ball pass them, not even if the spacewalks get involved. I can sort of see why this might have earned some contempt at the time, with reviewers thinking that this is just a complete bunch of old hat, and you may as well just grab an old Binatone or Grandstand or whatever POM machine rather than loading up this tape. But all the same, I think a 5% score is a bit harsh here. I mean, it's better than Teletennis. At least this doesn't crash after 2 minutes. And finally, we come to the worst rated game of them all. We go a fair ways back for this one. It's October 1984, and in the 9th issue of Crash, the team reviewed Elephant Software's Kosmik Pirate. 2 words that make hardened Sqij users tremble, right there. This game is actually second on the old World of Spectrum bottom 100, only beaten by Sqij, so it's most certainly got a pedigree. Now, how to even describe this? It's a lot like Voyage into the Unknown, although it's actually much, much worse. It makes Great Space Race look like frickin' R-Type. You load this game up, are greeted with a couple of choices on how to handle a hostile freighter. You press one of them, some coordinates flash up. You eventually get another choice, you press a key, and nothing happens. At all. Press 1 to attack, 2 to evade. Nothing. The game just beeps at you, over and over. You wonder if there's a fault somewhere, if you're doing something wrong. But 1984's reviewers had the same problem, complaining of an input response that can actually be measured in minutes. So no, you're not doing anything wrong. The game is just that bloody hopeless and unresponsive. You just need to keep pressing that key over and over again until finally it works. So then if that happens, you will eventually get another set of commands where you, again, very slowly, input some numbers, and you may even actually see a battle screen, at which point you realise that the movement keys don't work. At some point the game will likely crash, unless of course you've just turned it off in amazed frustration before then. Good lord. Crash Magazine gave this a rather befitting score, 3 whole percentage points, making it the worst rated Sqij game of all time from any of the big 3 mags. And honestly, it's just as bad as Sqij. The biggest insults of them all, perhaps, are that the game itself came with basically no instructions whatsoever, and it was not a budget title. Elephant Software charged £6 for this monstrosity. Forget about the ZX81 and ZX80, this gets thoroughly outstripped by an ancient clapped-out Sigma 7 one in the Star Trek teleprinter game. I thought Sqij was the worst Sqij game that I'd played by miles, but honestly, after seriously having a go at Kosmik Pirate, I can't decide between them. All I know is that they are both pure evil. And there we have it. Hopefully you've enjoyed this run through the games that the big magazines considered to be the very worst on the ZX Spectrum. Considering that the magazines did change the way that they rated games from time to time, this list may not necessarily be exhaustive, so there may well be some other stinkers out there that are worth looking at. Perhaps this subject is worth revisiting in the future. We shall see. Once again, a big thanks to Pete Proj for going through ZXDB and making a list of these games. That's come in very handy, and he's well worth following. But until the next time, bye for now.